Good morning. The Committee of the Whole is called back to order. I remind the panelists that you are still under oath. We left off last week on Friday with Senator Clint. We will now move to Senator Paris. Senator Paris, do you have any questions for the panelists?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning to all the panel members this morning. In looking at the difference between BBMR's budget and the OFB's budget, there are two big changes, or two big differences. Obviously, the one is the provision section, in which $55 million has been included in OFB's budget, but it hasn't been included in the BBMR budget. The other part is the BPT. And so there is a huge difference in BPT projections. And if I can just ask the questions from both groups, what is the reason for the huge difference in regards to what factors were used to predict these projections? So perhaps I can start with OFB.
Good morning, Senator. If I understand your question correctly, you just want to know the difference, the disparity between what OFB is proposing in the bill versus BBMR's numbers?
Yeah, just basically what factors did you use to arrive at the number that you got? And then I'll ask the same question of BBMR.
For the taxes, excluding the BBT, we normally use, historical trends. We use information data, especially for 21 and 22 was very unique year simply because, what the government and basically the whole island has been affected by the pandemic. So we threw a lot of those considerations in, and when we did the numbers actually came up pretty reasonable. And if you look at what we're looking for in 2022, we took into consideration what's not going to be available and happening in 2022 that's currently been happening in 20 and 21. Most especially the termination of the PUA program, loss of jobs, the income that's not going to be available for disposable income for a lot of our people here on Guam. So if you look at basically what we're tracking under OFB, if you look at the sheet, we are tracking basically 92.7, for example, in corporate. BBMR has it at 91.3, so we're pretty close. But what OFB is projecting is almost a $21 million decrease for 2022, because we realize that we're not going to be collecting at that rate in 2022 for corporate. Same thing with individual. Individual right now is tracking 79. OFB tracking is 79 million. BBMR is tracking 78.3 million. Our recommendation is actually 71. So there is a decrease again in that category simply because we don't feel that we're going to be collecting at the same rate come FY22. Withholding is probably one of the biggest reductions on the three taxes. Right now we are tracking, OFB is tracking 261 million. BMR is tracking 259 million, so we're just about 2 million difference. But what we're recommending in the bill is 235. So that alone is almost a $29 million decrease. And we don't anticipate to collect that money we don't anticipate to collect at the same rate come 2022 for withholding. And the main reason why is PUA. PUA alone contributes anywhere from $24 to $26 million annually in withholding tax. And that ends in September. Moving down to BBT is where probably we have the biggest disparity. And again, if you look at the tracking, we are basically tracking at 275 million. BBMR is tracking about 280 million, so we're about 5 million difference. But OEB's recommendation is actually dropping down to $238 million, which represents almost a $65 million decrease. And the reason being on that one, Senator, is, aside from losing all the income from PUA, tourism, again, stalemate, the possibility of us going down, instituting again restrictions and movements, we feel that BBT is probably going to take the biggest hit of all the taxes. It's difficult to project. I've talked to everybody, guys from accountants to economists, and their bottom line to me is that they believe that FY22 and 23 is going to probably be the worst financial period in Guam history. Nobody wants to make a prediction. Nobody wants to make any type of assessment of what's going to happen. And that to me is kind of alarming. When we got the experts out there kind of telling me that, they're not too sure exactly what's going to happen, that raises the red flag for me. So I prefer to be right now at least conservative. If I'm too conservative, then so be it. But I think it's a number that we can work with. I told people is that if we do collect beyond what we're projecting, we can always come back to the table and appropriate. But if we don't collect at least to the level that we are appropriating, then it's very difficult. And I'm telling you from my experience in Governor Guam, it's hard to de-appropriate funds. And so that's basically that's where our differences is and how we come about calculating. Remember, in FY20 and FY21 and FY19, Guam, we recorded highest number of tourism in Guam, 1.6 billion tourists. Last year we ended the total number of tourists, I believe, at 832,000. This year we are tracking, hopefully I'm thinking 42,000 tourists. GVB's number for next year at the low is 70,000, and at the high is 130,000 tourists. So if you look at the numbers, we collected, we estimate 305 million for BBT for FY21. I believe right now we're tracking, and I need to kind of go back and see what the July ones, but I think the last time we recorded we're lacking about 25 million behind in the BBT. So, using that trend going into FY22, knowing that we're not going to get anything close to what we got in terms of tourist economic activity and stuff like that, and if GBB says the most we're going to get, worst possible scenario is 70,000 tourists next year, that again is a red flag for me as compared to 832 we got last year. But remember, the only reason why we got that many is because the first 4 months of FY20 we were heading to record-breaking collections in taxes. Then all of a sudden February came, it just turned things around. From a positive growth in March, all of a sudden from a positive, I believe 30 million surplus in the government of Guam projected to the end of the year, all of a sudden, overnight, it went negative. So those are some of the issues and concerns we put into the mix when we came up with our numbers. And like I said, these are numbers I think that can go either way. But at this point, what's happening, the possibility of us going back into some sort of restriction is already an indication that, the growth is going to come to a sudden halt pretty soon. And it just depends how bad things get moving forward. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Steve. So the same question to BBMR, Lester Carlson. So if you can explain, how did you arrive at the projection of $295 million for BPT, and what factors did you look at in arriving at this number.
Thank you, Senator Perez. If it's okay with you, I'll begin and have Mr. Byrne chime in as well. I made an observation to the body last week, utilizing page 3 of OFB's presentation, where you look at the executive budget request level for individual income tax associated with what Mr. Guerrero is observing to be a potential problematic area. Similarly, with withholding payments and taxes. He's also being very conservative with 2022. Yet, my observation is that the $235 million executive budget request is mirrored in the OFB suggested level for withholding. The individual income tax executive budget request of $71 million is also mirrored by OFB, as well as the corporate income tax category. So the first 3 general fund items are accepted by both entities. It's only when we get to BPT there seems to be a departure from the overall agreement and assessment. We had 295, and the snapshot that I provided the body last week, Friday, shows that we're tracking 285. And Mr. Guerrero is correct that it is the primary source of general fund income revenue that has not been performing. But I will also ask you to go to page 3 of the little snapshot I gave you, wherein all the other tax categories have outperformed the adopted level. And right now, before we officially provide this to the group on the 20th, we are looking at a $19.6 million general fund revenue collection over the adopted level. I'm the 295, Senator Perez. If we're tracking 285 in a document that we submitted to the body in January with all the positive and negative changes in, particularly as it relates to tourism, the fact we weren't open, the fact that we are now open, we have got the Korean Airlines flying a weekly flight, which means that anybody who comes and takes the next Korean airline flight out stays here for a week, which is way over the traditional 3-4 night stay of our visitor profile. So they're spending more money and more time on Guam. I'm not married to 295, but I do believe that the 285 or 280 number is something that we can achieve. If hell goes, all goes to hell in a handbasket, we're all going to know this, and we're probably going to have to come back in and do what we did in 2018, which is a fiscal realignment plan. But I think right now, all the signs that we have indicate that barring a massive hospitalization and really ill people from COVID, we've set ourselves up pretty good to be recognized by our visitor markets as a viable tourism destination. I think that Ross' gesture with the returning of the bracelet is going to be immeasurable. I don't care what we say in social media. If somebody says, I left my Cartier bracelet in the Ross dressing room and somebody returned it, I mean, that's $2 million worth of advertising right there. So I just, we're here not to disagree in a disagreeable manner. We're here to provide input. And I would just like to acknowledge that 295 Senator Perez is a bit ambitious, and I'm more comfortable in the 280, 285 range, especially given the discussion that we had Friday, where the DOA and DRT people confirmed to the body that the ACTC and CTC funding will be coming to Guam in the form of a federal trust fund. So we don't have to appropriate that money from general fund revenues because that portion will be paid from a trust fund. The EITC we discussed Friday, we're uncertain as to whether or not that money will come in similarly in a trust fund, or if it is something that we're going to have to pay out, get reimbursed, and once the reimbursement comes in, it will be free for legislative appropriation. But we don't know that yet. So I would suggest that we come to some agreement on a BPT source. I don't know if Mr. Guerrero forwarded the discussion that we had late Friday, but we'd like to see those tax categories removed from the budget: EITC, ACTC, and the child tax credit. And we also suggested that the provision for tax refunds should be increased from 74 million to 87 million. And I think that if you were comfortable with an increase in BPT to cover that increase, so that we have sufficient funding for tax refunds, either to the federal trust fund and local appropriations, I think we can actually get there. And I'd like Mr. Byrne to also speak on this matter.
Yes, thank you, Senator. And I would like to support what Mr. Carlson says, that if, and it is portrayed in this budget, if incomes and the tax take from those incomes are similar to what BBMR projected back in January, I don't know that we have a good reason for thinking that the indirect taxes, which are the result of people spending those incomes, are going to be significantly different. Although, I would also agree that 295 million is probably too optimistic. If I could comment briefly on some of the other things that OFB said, this is a budget. We don't want to be too conservative with the budget because, just departments need to plan. If next July we suddenly find we have more BPT than we anticipated in the budget, if it's a large number, departments have a hard time putting together plans to spend those amounts before the year end. And then we get into a difficulty, we've got all these expenditures that carry over from one year to the next. That's not a position that government agencies want to be put into. So I would certainly support what BBMR says. From a cash flow point of view, we seem to be moving along at that rate. So I would ask certainly that the legislature considers both sides of this argument, but I would strongly support what BBMR said about increasing BPT. All the evidence points in that direction.
Thank you for the response. Just a follow-up question for Lester Carlson or Director Byrne. So in looking at last year's budget, there was a $304 million expectation or estimate from BPTs, but this year it's tracking at about 275 to 280 million, roughly an 8% decrease. So how would that, have you thought about that in your arriving at these numbers for BPT projections? I guess, yeah, the question can also go to OFB.
Yes, Senator. I was making reference to the snapshot that we gave you. So our projection for a full year of BPT, taking into account the fact that we gave you July numbers as of August 4th. So you got 2 more months, and we've been averaging, if you take a look at the page previous, we provided an estimate of receiving $23 million in BPT for the month of July. We actually got 27.5, or 3.862 million more than we had anticipated when we give you guys the allocations by fund source and by month that we're required to provide. So yes, Senator Perez, when I look at the tracking of 285 that was provided to you, I'm more comfortable with that being the high end, but I think 280 seems to be in line with Mr. Guerrero's conservatism, and I also think in line with the tax categories that precede this on page 4.
Do you have a response, Steve?
Referring to the draft of the CRA report that they did submit, and Mr. Carlson is correct. It seems like the monthly collections is going up to, I think, 2-3 million over last month, June. But I just want to make it clear that the trends that are happening today, that happened all year this year, is predicated on conditions of this year. We've got I believe there was a $200 million payout for tax refunds, I believe in April or June. Of course, EIP money also has been, dispersed. So that's giving a lot of, consumers spending power. But all of this is not going to be there next year. So the trend that you're looking at for the last couple of months is a trend that's, I believe, is going to take a beating starting next fiscal year. And for today, it looks good. I mean, I won't say no to what they're saying, but for me, this trend is not going to continue on next year. And with the bleak outlook in tourism for Guam, people are not going to be spending, they're going to be saving. I mean, for the real critical things now, instead of, buying stuff out the store, they're going to be saving their money to pay power and water. And the critical things that, some of them are taking for granted now because they feel that, money is still coming in. But when it gets tight, we just need to make sure that we don't over-obligate ourselves, and especially when it comes to thinking that all this money is going to come in. That's just our assumption of what's going to happen next year.
All right, thank you. So a question for Director Shimizu, or perhaps for the whole panel. So I'm looking at the subsidies thus far, EITC, ACTC, and CTC. If you add it all up, it totals about 100 million of the total, roughly about 145 million we pay out in tax refunds. What does this indicate about the state of Guam's economy?
Thank you, Senator Perez. With regards to the state of the economy, perhaps I may not be the expert on that. But with regards to what it means for our government and our people, and perhaps even our cash flow, although I defer on the cash flow discussion to DOA and BBMR, of course, we know that we've been paying out the earned income tax credit from, coming out of the general fund. So this means that now we're finally going to be able to get reimbursement for that, and so those monies, now will be able to be paid and have a funding source. So where we previously had an unfunded mandate, it's now being funded. The same goes for the child tax credit. Of course, we have not historically been reimbursed for the child tax credit, the regular child tax credit, although we are being reimbursed for ACTC, which is the additional child tax credit. So again, for the purpose of, in terms again of what this means is that again, for those refunds that have been being paid out, then now we do have a funding source. To go back, though, to our discussion with regards to this, kind of as an extension of what we discussed Friday, though, as we know, the Earned Income Tax Credit, we have not yet engaged in discussions with IRS and the Treasury about that. Likely, again, we will not be able to get into those discussions until we're done with the Child Tax Credit discussion. I'm hoping, and we've been hoping for the last several weeks, that we'd be able to finalize our CTC discussions so we can begin to get those paid out to our people. And we'll have a final number on that, but we don't have that yet. But again, I guess overall, just basically means that, again, where we've had to fund things out of the general fund, and again, I defer to on the source of funds, now we'll have an actual funding source for these payments.
Thank you, Director Shimizu. I guess the same question to BBMR. So knowing that about 100 million of the 145 million that we paid as tax refunds will be reimbursed, so how would that affect, or what does it indicate, and how would it affect this, Guam's economy?
Thank you, Senator Perez. I think the big takeaway is that finally we're going to have federal relief for unfunded mandates, as Director Shimizu mentioned. I think there was discussion Friday that you're going to see a migration of ACTC recipients to the CTC, which is good. We will have federal sources to pay for eligible families that have the children, and it'll be less of a burden, as evidenced by OFB's reduced general fund requirement for tax refunds. It took me a little while to kind of get to how they got there, and when we sat down Friday, I told Steve and Llewellyn, okay, now I get it. It was a little bit of a new concept, but I get it, you know. But similarly, we're putting ourselves generally in a very, very good position this fiscal year. I will again remind you that I brought my budget from FY21, and our total set aside for debt service in this current fiscal year is $95,989,272 versus $66,745,638. So you've got, you know, about a $30 million general fund and a little bit in special fund because of the hot bonds of reduced general fund obligations. So right off the bat, with a potential transition and into normalcy or continuation of where we are, you've also set the table very well. And again, I'm going to say thank you again for starting fiscal year 22 with $30 million less of debt obligations to pay. That plus we got the $11 million extra in Section 30. I think that you have the foundation to build upon the budget with the work that you've done before and done very well. So we're talking primarily kind of like last year when we were haggling over $7 million. You know, I don't feel like haggling. I just feel that you guys have done a great job. I know how OFB took the reduced general fund obligations and use that to offset the special fund operations, and I commend them for doing that. They did a really good job of that. So I think what we have before us is more of a question to the body as to whether or not you feel 238 or you feel 280. And we do. And I'm sorry, Madam Speaker, I did not write anything to Mr. Guerrero on Friday. We had a conversation as we were wrapping up Friday. But we are anticipating making a $12 billion payment from Child Tax Credit, the trust fund, in this fiscal year. So we're asking for an upward adjustment of the $74 million to take into account that we need to repay the 12 that we're going to be paying this year. Therein, the increase in the set-aside for tax refunds not being 74, but closer to 87. And I think that if the body feels comfortable that at a minimum, you move the BPT up so that you have an offset in revenue versus the appropriation, that's a great start.
All right, thank you. OFB, would you like to respond to the question about the EITC, ACTC, and CTC totaling about 100 million of the 145 million of tax refunds? What does that say about Guam's economy, and perhaps what are the implications of getting that reimbursed?
If you look at the FY21 budget and the budgets before that, we have set aside 125 million for tax refunds every year in the budget. And that is an amount net, the ACTC, which I believe the estimate we were using was 20 million. I think today it's kind of like went up to about 23 million. But if you add the 125 plus the estimated 20 million a year, it comes up to 145. So we use the 145 as a benchmark to determine how much money we have to set aside for the tax refunds, considering also the reimbursement of the CTC and the EITC and the ACTC. So when we did the math, the bottom line, what we're setting aside, which last year and the year before was 125, we're setting aside 74 million, which we feel is adequate to cover the tax refunds, considering, the reimbursement we're getting and what the total tax payout would be of 145. So, it's just remember in the presentation that we're doing in the bill, the 55 and the 35 is not being appropriated. It's just there for transparency purpose for you to see how we're doing the deductions and how much is actually going to the how much is part of that 74 million. So, although you're not seeing the traditional 125 and only 74 I think is the amount that would be adequate to cover tax refunds. Bear in mind, too, that, one of the, I guess, the caveat of this whole thing is the timing of the reimbursement. I believe, we don't pay tax refunds until January. So, come January, if we go into FY22 and pass this, the administration has 74 million to play with, at least for the next, first quarter, second quarter. And by then, I'm sure we would have gotten some sort of refund or reimbursement from the federal, either the EITC, the CTC, or additional child tax credit. So, it's not like we're not giving the administration any funding to pay the tax refunds. There is money there. And it's just a matter of, maybe the aggressiveness and the timing of when we file these reports and how fast we get the reimbursements. And I've been told, Revenue Tax has indicated that, we don't know when these reimbursements are going to come. But, I believe for FY21, they're working aggressively trying to get at least the CTC reimbursed, if I'm not mistaken. So, if we get the CTC reimbursed for 21, I mean, that's an additional 35 million you can put aside. So, unless I'm not understanding this right, that's my understanding of how this works. It goes into the income tax trust fund. These monies are available to pay out tax refunds.
All right, thank you. Another question. So in the OFB presentation the other day on Friday, on slide 5, it talks about the allocation of the general fund, in which 38% goes to public education and 1% goes to economic development. I guess the question is for the panel: how can the government better appropriate and allocate funds to help transform our economy at this point? So the question can go towards BBMR.
Senator, are you looking to be able to advance economic diversification issues?
Yes, that's part of that question. So, we're looking at the budget. This is an opportune time to really reinvigorate, diversifying our economy. Yes, is definitely one part of it. Or other ways that we can rebuild our economy. I mean, I know education is a big part of it. How can we retool our agencies to respond effectively to the economic downturn?
Just off the top of my head, some of the responses from UOG and GCC have been pretty appropriate, given some switches to the Guam Green Growth Initiative and some of the ideas and actual projects coming out of UOG. I think GCC has been exemplary in their tooling of apprenticeship programs. But as far as anything that we haven't embarked upon now, if there is a desire from the body and there's a consensus from the body to fund X in an agreed upon diversification initiative, I don't see any of that in the budget. So you'd probably have to do one of the nastier things, which is take something from somebody to fund this. Or maybe you feel comfortable that there's a little upward mobility in the BPT to allow for that to happen. Whatever the body feels is an appropriate avenue to fund. Diversification is always great. I do agree with that, but there's no funding for it in the budget.
All right. If I can get a response from OFB. So what can we do at this time to help reinvigorate government? So how can we better appropriate and allocate funds to help transform the economy?
Well, to answer your question, Senator Perez, the reason why basically that public education gets the majority of the pie is, please bear in mind also that DOE, based on the requirement of the MOE, we have to appropriate minimum amount to DOE every year to maintain their status of receiving federal funds. So I believe this year the appropriation that were out of the general fund is about 197 million. So that in itself is taking a huge amount of basically general fund sources, and included with this amount is UOG and GCC, and I think one of the other two, which is represents public education. As far as how we can grow and diversify economic development, we provide appropriations based on the requests made in the executive budget, and of course those requests and amendments that are done on the floor. But as far as if you're asking me what my own personal opinion is, I need to sit down and talk to the folks out there and figure out why economic development is only at 1%. But I believe it's more an administration function to kind of determine that and focus and maybe divert some of the funding available in other program categories to economic development. But typically it's not OFB's, I won't say responsibility, but we just normally review what is in front of us, our requests, and appropriate accordingly. We don't recommend to the point of what programs and what departments in terms of function and operation.
All right, thank you so much. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Perez. Senator Mann, do you want to have, you have any questions, ma'am? Or you want to wait for second round? Second round, okay. Senator Brown, do you have any questions for the panel?
How could I not, Mr. Chairman? Thank you. Looking at the information provided, we appreciate all the effort and time that's been put into coming up with these respective numbers, and I'm seeing very much a division, obviously, between the Office of Budget and Finance and the administration's presentation. As I've mentioned during the budget hearings that we've had over the last few months, we're living in a very artificial economy right now. And the numbers that we are getting, while some of them look very nice and rosy, I think are part of the reality that we have a substantial amount of federal money that's subsidizing our existence here on Guam. We all know, September is just a matter of a few weeks away, and those that have been unemployed, that have been receiving federal funds, we've seen a decrease in those amounts, and ultimately we're going to see that end. So the money coming in through that process is going to be affected. I find it very difficult, Mr. Chair, as we move forward in looking at this budget, considering that there are areas of our economy that have been directly, obviously impacted by this pandemic, to simply look at this budget in isolation of itself from the realities of what's happening outside this session hall. I think we all recognize with regards to our private sector economy, if we're simply going to rely on our own economic engine, we'd be looking at very different numbers. And certainly the presentation that Mr. Guerrero, you've made with regards to what we may be looking at within the next year or two in terms of our budget, it should give us reason to pause at this point, that we just can't simply continue to proceed as if all is well, and we'll just get a budget passed based on what we have coming in and the general fund revenue, and deal with this issue in isolation of the other realities out there, including the amount of money that the federal government's also provided, that the governor has yet publicly to the people of Guam relay on how she intends to spend these funds. And I think that's a very important component, because as we look at this budget this fiscal year moving forward, I think we need to look at the government holistically, because this is one government for our very one and single community here on Guam, in terms of how we're going to address these shortfalls, and how are we going to look even more importantly in the next fiscal year and the year after. I'm very concerned that while we may be in some areas generous this fiscal year, I don't want to be, giving the money out today and then taking it back tomorrow. I'm concerned if we do additional hirings in the government of Guam and add people on the payroll, and then where are we going to be a year from now? Then we'll be the bad guys having to not fund positions that have been hired. So I think we need to look at it, and I appreciate the perspective of the administration, but I think we do need to look at this budget in a conservative perspective. Where we're at and the realities of where we're at outside of the federal money that's floating this government is a very different reality. And I don't think we can operate outside of that. I think we all like the glowing picture of the finances, but we know that's not real, and it's very temporary. And depending on how this ARC money is spent, and how it's going to address the shortfalls that come in the year after from where we are today, I think we also need to look at that. And I think in absence of that, unless the administration representatives have any different position, are you expecting us to look at this budget without in any way knowing how the administration on behalf of the people of Guam plan on spending this ARC money?
Is that a question, ma'am?
Yes.
Okay. Yes, the answer to the question is yes. We are asking you to take into account the revenues that the general fund gets past the budget without the ARP introduction.
Well, but the intent of this money, again, is to offset the financial impact that our community has suffered as a result of this pandemic. And I think we can agree, Mr. Guerrero, if you look at your numbers with regards to our tourism sector, other funds, for example, like customs and quarantine, they came forth and presented to the legislature during the budget hearing that they are short in revenue. And I don't know if anything has been made up in the last month since they came before the legislature, stating that they did not have funds to pay their rent to the airport. They did not have funds to purchase fuel for their vehicles. Has that issue been addressed? I think we can all agree that those are two key examples that we could look at that have been directly affected as a result of this pandemic due to the decrease of travelers into the island. Obviously, the same can apply for our tourism industry with regards to TAF funding. So those are things that have been directly impacted by the pandemic. So if we're expected to operate in isolation of that reality and fund a budget, I don't think we're putting a real realistic picture forward to our people. Has that issue with regards to the shortfalls in customs been addressed by the administration?
It's a work in progress, but I'd like to report that the differential pay for customs, we found money to be able to take care of their differential pay requirements up to March. So we are doing whatever we can with the abilities that we have to address their operational requirements.
Have they received their money for fuel? Have they received their money to pay their rent to the airport, which I'm sure also is suffering decrease with regards to their revenue unless there's an inordinate amount of travelers coming through the island that we're not aware of.
The Customs struck a deal with the airport for rental deferral. I don't know when the deferral period ends, but they've arranged that.
Yeah, well, again, I don't think I can agree with the position that's been taken. I think we need to be upfront with regards to our public here and our people and the money that actually has been provided on their behalf, because I don't agree moving forward, Mr. Chair, in addressing a budget without knowing how these funds are going to be spent, including how it's going to be spent to direct department and agencies that serve our public that have been directly impacted by this pandemic. Yes, I'm sorry, Senator Sabina had quite a substantial amount of time since Friday.
The one thing I can tell everybody here is that throughout the entirety of the pandemic, government services have gone on unimpeded. Government employees have been paid for their very brave and sometimes heroic assistance in response to the pandemic. There was differential pay that was provided for first responders. That was taken care of. We have not had an instance in which any obligation to our employees has not been made. Now, if we're looking for fuel, I'm honestly quite unaware of fuel requirements, to be honest with you, Senator. I know Mr. Pareto is talking to me about different items. He hasn't asked me about fuel, but by and large, his staff continues to perform their duties. And as I mentioned, they were made good with their differential pay up to March. So we're doing the best that we can with what we have.
Well, for the record, it was a public statement that that director made with regards to that issue, with regards to his operations. I wanted to ask Mr. Guerrero with regards to, you mentioned that the biggest hit has been to the BPT, but with regards to the other special funds to the government, what's the overall impact of collection with regards to the special funds in the government of Guam, and where we are going to be, what we assume is going to be a substantial decrease in revenue collection? What would that figure be?
For FY21, Senator, for the 6 major categories in special funds, being the Guam Highway Fund, the TAF, I believe solid waste, and I can't think of the other one, but all 6 major categories are underperforming. We anticipate, at least by the end of the year, maybe a $20 million deficit in these special funds alone. Bear in mind that, when special funds do not perform up to par, the general fund covers these expenses. So if you look in the OFB budget, we are actually reducing special funds by $16 million for 2022. I hope that, we can be able to rebound back in some areas. I believe in solid waste might be an area that we can come back, but definitely TAF, I don't believe we will, not to the level of what we had in 20 and maybe 21. 21, I think we're estimating, 15 million. We're hovering, hopefully get up to 12 or 13, or maybe hopefully 14 million by the end of the year. But for the most of the, and those 6 categories, Senator, are very alarming to me, simply because they are basically one of the bulk of special funds that fund major agencies. And the thing about the special funds is these funds are designed to fund agencies, and when these agencies don't collect, the funds don't collect, and the agencies basically are impacted. Case in point, custom and quarantine. I believe historically, custom and quarantine's revenue range about 13 million per annum. Right now, they're hovering about, I think 3 million at the
And
most.
how much would you say, Mr. Guerrero, how much are we subsidizing then directly out of the general fund, customs and quarantine?
Mr.
Right
Guerrero,
now?
before you answer, please, if I may, Senator Brown, just for the record, I'm not the timekeeper. There is a timekeeper here. I'm not sure how much time was allotted to Senator Perez.
I appreciate it, but
I understand.
I understand, Mr.
just
Chair.
to-
I've only got two more quick questions,
Ju-
but I
just-
would appreciate
Yes,
parity
yes.
and on the floor, because when you allow one member to go on and ask a number of questions that almost extended into a half hour this morning, and then cut me off when I'm asking my remaining questions, I don't think that's fair.
Let me explain also the way that it's being calculated. It's not just based on how much time is taken. It's actually based on how much time the individual is taking to ask the question. Any answers are not counted as time.
I understand, but
So-
I doubt to the degree those questions were asked, that time was kept to the same equity that I'm being placed under at the
I will
moment.
check with the clerk to see exactly how much
I
time
have two
was
more
al-
questions,
was
Mr.
allowed.
Chair, and then I'll be happy
and
to quietly sit back and listen to everyone else ask their questions.
I will check with the clerk to see how much time was actually afforded to the previous senator.
Yes, please, because I
But
sat
at the
here for
same
quite a
time,
substantial amount of
I will allow you to
time.
ask. You said you have two more questions?
Yes,
I will
I
allow
do.
those two more questions and then ask that we move on after that. But at the same time, I will verify with the clerk how much time was allotted to the previous.
Well, then to ensure all equity, put a timer in front so everyone can see like the court does, and then we know that nobody's going over their time. I don't mind fairness. I'm here to play
I
ball,
agree
and I'm
with
normally
the,
here
with
to
a
play
timer
ball. No
being
problem.
seen by everyone. I have no problem with that if we can
Mr.
figure that
Guerrero,
out.
so we don't take up more time with regards, how much are we subsidizing? The two funds I mentioned, we had the TAF and we also had customs and quarantine. How much are we subsidizing more out of the general fund than we were prior to the pandemic? And then I'll ask you my last question on this round right after that.
I believe for custom and quarantine, the fund, we projected at least 12 million for them. They're hovering, I believe, 3 or 4 million, so most likely, hopefully by the end of the year. And because I believe 85% of their appropriation is for personnel, I would safely say we're probably going to subsidize them at least 7-8 million easy. Just
How
because-
much was that?
$7 or $8 million by the end of the
So
year.
we're going between $7 to $8 million that we're subsidizing customs as a result of the decrease of their revenues coming in.
Yes, ma'am.
And with regards to TAF, how much are we subsidizing TAF as a result of the impact of the tourism industry?
Right now, Senator, based on what we know and what we see, I believe maybe in the rounds of about $6 million this year.
My last question this round, with regards, I noticed in the budget bill, there's a section removing the rainy day fund to put aside what we look at as a 2% of the budget to set aside for emergencies. How much are we removing out of the savings by removing that, assuming that we adopt that language and keep that in the budget bill? The removal of the rainy day fund.
The amount that we're appropriating this year for the rainy day fund is around $12 million, Senator. We are also asking at the same time that $12 million be available for appropriation. And the reason being is that, again, like I said earlier, that the general fund is tracking. I mean, not to what we expect it to be at the 305. I mean, especially like in the BBT, we're probably going to suffer anywhere from a $25 million shortfall, $20 million shortfall by the end of the year. Again, bear in mind the shortfall in the special funds of about $20 million. So just those two categories alone, you're talking about $40 million. So if that money is not available come FY22, and the appropriation that we're doing this year is less than FY21, that money will come in. I mean, it'd be important in terms of appropriation and keeping programs afloat. But again, it's just a request that through our budget that we did identify the 12 million, the 2% set aside, but we're also asking at the same time that money be made available for appropriation.
Okay, Mr. Guerrero, thank you for your response. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Brown. And just for the record, to clarify, we have more than one timekeeper. My understanding is we have a few timekeepers that are all working together on this. And for the previous senator's questions, she did not go over the time limit. Most of the time was taken up by the responses to the questions. That's why it seems long. But you're only being timed on how long it takes you to ask the question or how long you're talking. The responses, if the responses are long from the members of the panel, that's not being timed. So that's what makes some people's time look longer than others, is because the panel members may be taking longer to answer the questions. So I just wanted to clarify that. And
Mr. Chair, if I may, yesterday we received a copy of the draft CRER report on revenues, but we didn't get one for the CRER report draft for special funds. Can we ask the panel if they can provide that to us as well, please?
sure. Senator Atta.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Good morning. Good morning, everyone. Mr. Hiles, I have a question for you. You've seen the effects of the lockdown in the previous year and what it had in the economy, both jobs and also revenue collections or expenditures by our people. In your opinion, what would be the effects of a lockdown again should the governor declare another emergency to close the economy? What do you think those effects would be, and how much of the business sector you think would be able to sustain that closure?
The effect would depend on several things. One, the duration of the lockdown, and it would also depend on the money the local residents have available to spend. If the lockdowns were, since previously we did not have any significant level of tourism, and we don't at this time, it's a little better, but I would suspect the lockdown would have a similar effect on employment.
I see. And would
But hopefully not for that continued duration. It might be less also because of the high level of vaccinations that companies may be able to continue to be open, whereas in last year, due to the vaccinations not being widely rolled out yet, lockdown was and shutdown was the only option.
So in your opinion, should businesses go back to 25-50% of capacity, and do you think it would affect employment with businesses keeping on their employees, or do you see an increase in unemployment? And I understand that, these are just kind of, we're just kind of seeing how it would lead to there when, vaccinations are, we're at 80%, whatever it may be, but
Yeah.
just the effects of another.
The lockdown would
reduction.
have some negative effect on business revenue and employment, perhaps not to the extent that we experienced previously.
Okay, thank you. I have another question for OFB. Mr. Guerrero, what would be if the revenues on special funds continue to decline and the current budget proposal, would the general fund be able to absorb that type of impact to the special funds to pay out from the general fund with what's supposed to be appropriated to the different agencies and
You're referring to FY21, Senator. Right now, like I said, the six major special funds are already tracking 20 million below. So that in itself is already an indication that, the general fund is already subsidizing these special funds. If you look at the bill as compared to the FY21 level, we've actually reduced special fund by $14 million in anticipation that things hopefully, will improve, but we're also being very cautious and knowing that what we know what happened last year and what's happening this year, we were taking more and more, I would say, a more, I won't say conservative, but more realistic approach in how we feel revenues will come in next fiscal year. And most likely, again, should revenues not collect up to what we are appropriating, the general fund will probably have to come in and subsidize it.
And that's what I was talking about in 22, is that would the general fund be able to, even with the reduction of 14 million on the special funds that you mentioned, would the general fund be able to subsidize additional revenues with the current budget proposal that you have?
What we are projecting right now in the general fund is already being allocated, Senator. If there is additional shortfalls to be realized in the special funds, then either these shortfalls be addressed through the reallocation, either through governor's transfer or some other funding source that's not already obligated within the budget.
Okay, I see. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mr. Chair, that's the only questions I have for this round. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Senator Ada. Senator Moylan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First question for DRT, and referring back to the report regarding the CTC and ACT credit, and your comment on the tax refunds. So just in that line, I read in the papers that DRT is really doing excellent in making out the tax refund payments. So congratulations for that. I constantly see 6 million, 10 million, 14 million paid out in tax credits. So kudos for that. And I'm sure it's not going to stop because as of now, without these tax credits for the CTC or the ACT, you're making these payouts for the tax refunds, correct? I mean, you're not banking on needing that money in order to continue the hard work that you've been doing.
With regards to the payment of refunds, of course, you know what, we work very closely with the Department of Administration with regards to cash availability. And so how it works, Senator Moylan, is so well, it's been really on a weekly basis now, probably since like around March 2019 or so, that we've been, communicating with the Department of Administration, send them an email or we'll talk with them about how much available cash there is so that way we can ensure that we can get, to the extent that we have processed returns, we can go get those paid out. So on the issue of the cash availability, I will have to defer to the Department of Administration.
Senator, in contrast to previous years when tax refunds tend to accumulate and then got paid out in greater sums, we, as the director says, have worked very closely with DRT, and we've been paying out the refunds as the refunds have been identified in people's tax returns. And I think you saw in the press release for Friday that we've paid out tax refunds for filers with error-free returns up to April 25th.
Thank you. So without the access to CTC or ACT refunds, will you be continuing to make these payouts? Are you projecting that, or are you saying we're going to be short and it's do or die unless we get this money?
Well, these refunds are basically for next year. We're going to continue to pay out tax refunds for taxpayers' returns for 2020 as we've been going along, and these particular credits that we're going to get really relate to next year's or 2021 tax returns that are filed in 2022.
And with BBMR's discussion with you and us, are you projecting that you'll need this money in the following fiscal year for tax refunds?
Well, insofar as we've got more child tax credits to pay than we had recently, it's obviously helpful to have the federal subsidy, because the amount that we anticipate to get paid out in child tax refunds is higher. EITC goes along as before, and the federal credit simply allows us to pay that out of federal funds, which again is obviously helpful because we're not paying it out of local funds. Therefore, those local funds are available for other uses, and those other uses have been used in this budget.
Okay. Have we used any of the in the CARES funding or the current ARPA funds, any of that money for tax refunds?
No, sir.
Where's the money for ARPA now being held in? You mentioned the trust, and I thank you for your reply back, Mr.
Yes, sir.
Burns, as well.
Senator, I responded to your letter. It's being held in an account which is a kind of federally insured account, ready to be drawn when used.
Okay. And this is trust account is in which bank?
It's not really in any bank. It's we used the services of the trust department of Bank of Guam, but it's basically in a mutual fund.
All right.
It's not really a mutual fund because it's a federal fund, but that's the best way of describing it.
Okay, so the trust account the trust department is through Bank of Guam, and then they invest the money. Okay, very good. Does the U.S. Treasury Department dictate where this refund will be going to? If we're expecting this refund, are they dictating where it should be held in, or is that up to the government of Guam?
The refunds, sir, or the ARP funds?
I'm sorry, the refund, the CITC credit, CTC or EITC credit, thank you.
Well, the CTC, it was my understanding, has to be held in a trust account, but they haven't nominated any particular account. EITC, as we said on Friday, we don't yet know. For CTC, my understanding is the Treasury has said it has to be held in a trust fund account, but it didn't specify where that trust fund account be held. EITC, we don't have any instructions for yet.
Does OFB have access to view those figures via the trust?
All these entries, the accounting entries, are made into the AS400 system.
We're making some interest in the current ARPA funds.
Senator, as you know, interest rates are pretty low at the moment, but whenever we can, yes, we are making some interest. And I think in the information that I provided to you, the estimated annual interest, assuming there were no draws on the fund, which is obviously an unlikely situation, was like $100,000 a year.
Based on the report provided, can you let us know what has been paid out so far from this fund? The report that you provided me, please.
Yeah, you're talking in money?
Yes.
Well, this report was as of July 31st, right? So as you can see, we had just paid out the quarantine facilities, and that's all that's been paid out so far.
We'll make some copies. Yeah, that was a recent report. DOE was polite enough to answer some of the FOIA questions. I'll just ask the Sergeant of Arms to have that report scanned and placed on the drive so we can all see it, please. Sergeant of Arms, that's the same report. Just give it to clerk, and then the clerks can put it on the drive. Yes, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
All right, why don't we take a few-minute recess so we can get that document and everybody else can get that. Thank you. Recess for a couple of minutes. Committee of the Whole is called back to, is returned from recess. Senator Jim.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Next question again, back to DOA, and I believe my colleagues have the report already provided. Again, thank you, Mr. Byrd, for answering some of my FOIA questions. I appreciate your understanding. Thank you for that. But going to that, maybe you can just help direct us to that page 1, just on the portfolio summary, so we can understand clearly the value of the account from this ARPA funds from June to July, and the projected income earned based on the interest if it performs correctly.
Okay, Senator, first of all, I think I should point out that none of this is contemplated in the budget. This is an entirely separate sum of funds that derive from the federal government. When we received the money from the federal government, it would have been irresponsible to have just left it in a checking account. Just like when you or I get a windfall, we don't leave lots of money in the checking account, we try and put it in a savings account. There aren't too many funds that can, certainly as far as Guam is concerned, that can absorb the sums of money that we actually received. So we had originally used the Stonecastle account, which is another mutual fund, for want of better words, but we ran up against the limit, which is 25 million. As you can see, we've got 25 million and a little bit because of the interest that accrued in that account. So we had to look for another fund that could and would accept these funds and would generate some. As you can see from the right-hand column, the estimated annual yield percentage is for these accounts is 0.03. Interest rates are very low. It's challenging to earn significant amounts of interest in these accounts, but where the estimated annual income column is the amount that would be earned if that amount of money that you can see in the second column were maintained in that account for a year. As I mentioned a few minutes ago, these are federal government obligations. The investment in the amount that we've got there at 556 million is invested in federal government obligations because we wanted the money to be in a safe account. We're not there to gamble with money, and that would be certainly a dangerous thing to do. So these are invested in federal obligations, which are considered to be gold-plated, if you like.
Thank you, sir. So for your total assets on the interest, which in the federal bonds there, that at 0.03, your estimated annual income, the total from the different investments would be how much?
Senator, as you can see from the total of the penultimate column, the estimated annual income is 146 million, but that depends on maintaining that balance there for a year, which I think we're all accepting is not going to happen. We have, when the governor has made her decision, that money will start flowing out and back into the economy.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Next question for BBMR. Does BBMR consider these refunds that we're discussing now that we don't want to show on our report for the child tax credit and the additional child tax credit, would you consider that under the executive branch and not the legislature branch? Is it the governor's control or is it OFB's control? Is it the Senate's legislature branch control? So you're talking about the child tax credit and the additional child tax credit money? Yeah? So I think Director Shimizu mentioned Friday that that funding is expected to come in the form of a federal trust fund. So that is great news for us because we will have federal money to pay. So it doesn't, as Mr. Burns said on Friday, because of the origin of the funds, it should not be in the general fund. It should be in a federal trust account available for the purposes under which we are receiving the money. It does assist us greatly from a budgetary standpoint because we know we have funds to take care of the obligations for those eligible filers, but it does not belong in the budget. Okay, thank you. Last question for OFB. So we know this money's in the trust fund and the future money that we're talking about and debating about is going to go into the trust, managed by the trust rather. Can you see everything, all the money that goes into the trust that they are discussing, where it's invested and how much is paid out, or do you have to FOIA that information?
Senator, yeah, unfortunately, OFB does not have access to the real detailed accounts in the AS400 system. Historically, we've been given preview just to view and browse the files in the AS400. But to answer your question specifically on this particular portfolio investment, the answer is no. I do not have that type of access.
Okay, thank you. DOA, I hope we can assist us in getting more of that access. But thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, panel.
Thank you, Senator Moreland. Senator Duenas, do you have any questions for the panel?
Mr. Chairman, yes, I do. And just one comment as for what I've heard from the panel so far. I want to congratulate the 35th Guam Legislature, you and OFB, in terms of haggling and making sure that we have a more conservative budget. Right now, the current projections of excess would be $9 million less if we would have adopted those revenues. So I think we want to do the same thing now. Mr. Guerrero, OFB, I want to put this to rest once and for all. In my opinion, I think your analysis is correct, and we should keep in the ACTC, additional ACTC, as well as EITC for purposes of accountability. Because I don't see how, whether or not you've adopted 75 or 82 million on the bottom line, I don't see how we arrive there without enumerating the contemplated reimbursements. Do you concur with my assessment?
For purposes of transparency, Senator, yes, I agree with you.
My second question, Mr. Guerrero, and I will ask this also to the panel from the governor's office. The way I'm reading this, right now, as contemplated, the EITC is fully set aside to expend in this graph on page 3, is fully anticipated to be expended for the purposes of tax refunds. Am I correct?
Senator, if you notice the way we allocated the funding in Chapter 1 of the revenues, we took the EITC total, which is around, I believe, 55 million, and then we set aside 35 million for the hospital. We set aside 5 million for DOC. These are pending bills that have already kind of like obligated these monies should these bills pass. So we took the balance of that 15 million of the 55 you minus the 40, and that 15 million is being applied to tax refunds.
So you're saying then that we've made that money available for appropriation on anticipation of reimbursement of EITC?
The 15 million, Senator, is not really appropriated. It's part of a set-aside that we do annually, just like the 125 million we've done last year and the years before. That 125, what we do is we just take it off the top, okay, of the total revenues. And then from there, we allocate the balance of that as funds available for appropriation. So instead of 125 this year, it's showing the 74. But it's the same thing.
So then we've now then essentially appropriated the 35 and the 5 and the like as described below the adopted revenues.
You can say we obligated it, yes, we set it aside.
Okay, so Mr. Carlson, in your anticipation of saying that you believe we should pull that out and that shouldn't be in here, then what is that anticipation? That reimbursement then would be set aside for tax refunds or for budgetary purposes? Because you've said we should not contemplate those funding sources appropriated for debt service.
Thank you for the question, Senator. If I could just go back a little bit as it relates to ACTC, something that we've been getting for years. In the current fiscal year budget, we do not appropriate ACTC. On page 8, it basically says that any ACTC money that comes in, 90% goes directly to tax refunds and 10% provides assistance to DRT. As far as accountability, when Senator Cruz was the chair, he told us not to put that in as far as revenue. So you'll see on footnote number 3 of the snapshot I gave you that we've received ACT reimbursements for October, January, April, and July. So when we do get the ACTC reimbursements, you are made aware of what it is that we got, with the full understanding that if it's $100, 90 goes into the Income Tax Efficiency Payment Fund and $10 goes to help DRT. So the transparency and the prior marching orders from the former OFB chairman are kind of what we're doing here. And we're thinking that if it's going to be a similar exercise with respect to now the child tax credit, this whole thing is going to be changed because we're paying for this with our money. We won't have to use our money to make these payments. It's a game changer. So I still, contrary to your position, I still don't think that it needs to be there, because once we get it in the trust fund, you don't need to appropriate.
But I'm being specific to the EITC, Mr. Carlson, because what we're contemplating here is appropriating the reimbursement for the hospital facility, for the prison. You have put on the record so far that you don't think we should be doing that. So I want to stick to EITC.
Yeah, okay. So first and foremost, sir, we don't know with the same degree of certainty that we have with ACTC and CTC how we're going to get EITC. We don't know. We know we're going to get it, but we don't know if it's going to be given to us cash up front or if it's going to be a reimbursable. If it's cash up front, it'll be in a federal thing, and we'll just use it like we're going to be using the ACTC and the CTC. If, in fact, it's a reimbursable, we pay for it. We put in for the reimbursement, and that, I think once we get a reimbursement, it's something that can be appropriated. Okay. But if it's in a trust fund, we can't use it. But we don't know, and that's the point we're trying to make to you guys. As much as we'd like to be helpful in answering that one specific, it's a big question, we just don't have the answer yet.
Well, and it's important because we have to debate this. We've obviously have differences in terms of what we're going to adopt as revenues. But we also have differences in terms of what's been placed in here and available for appropriation. So that is absolutely going to be clear too, because even the administration, as far as I'm concerned, under a reimbursement scenario, doesn't have authority to use the funds. It would have to be appropriated. Because if you're saying don't appropriate it for these projects, then it's not available for use unless it's appropriated.
I do not disagree with that, but I guess we'll find out when the rules come out.
Okay. So going back to OFB, I agree with your adopted conservative number. I just have two final questions. One is even with the anticipation of the optimism of ATC, additional ATC and EITC, whatever reflection that has in terms of revenues, is that even close to the hundreds of millions of dollars that have come in under federal money to generate economic activity to not be conservative?
That one, Senator, you know, it's just, for me, it's just kind of like, when I think about it, what we're doing on the CTC and the ACTC right now, the way we read in the law is that 90% of that money, the federal reimbursement, is for tax refunds. 10% is reserved for revenue and tax for operation. The EITC, the whole amount is actually being reserved for tax refunds. So if you're asking me whether or not, you know, the impact of hundreds of millions of federal dollars is anything, I'm not too sure if I got your question right, if it's going to impact, you know, the amount that we're setting aside or receiving for EITC, I would say it could be. You know, I mean, the more money we get in federal assistance, the better off we are. I mean, it helped basically run this government. If I'm not mistaken, I heard something in the media either yesterday or the other day, I'm not too sure when, was the governor herself said that, you know, any shortfall incurred in 21 and 22, the administration is ready and able to cover those shortfalls. So when we prepared the FY2022 budget, not having any information on any federal funds, whether it be ARP money or any other federal assistance money, we appropriated what we anticipate to generate in revenues in FY22 accordingly, like we do every year, without the benefit and the opportunity of having any other information, such as, you know, federal assistance money.
So, Steve, in the conservative revenue forecast, does it cover all of the budget ceilings as presented by the administration in the process?
To answer your question, Senator, I do believe so. And, you know, the director of BBMR has stated earlier last week that he agrees with the ceiling that we set. He has no problem with the ceilings that we set for all the agencies in the executive budget. So I feel comfortable that our appropriation was more than adequate to meet the needs of the agencies in 2022.
Lester, going back to the airport, you currently were out in San Francisco refunding those bonds, correct? You mentioned that there's been a deferral of rent from customs. Was that presented to the bondholders?
Yes, it was.
Okay. I just think it's important because in the past, every time we've dealt with anything with regard to funding from the airport, it has always been the inability to not allow for customs to pay rent because of the fact that it affects repayment ability because it's considered an income. So I just wanted to put that on the record because I was concerned about that. I know that in a media outlet, the airport has represented that the governor is committed to $20 million under ARP for the airport. So I think if that comes to fruition, there should be no problem in terms of covering any deferrals. But I wanted to make sure that we wouldn't affect our bondholders and the calls of those bonds because of the fact that that revenue has been deferred.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Brown knows from firsthand experience, having done the port bond, the due diligence and disclosure is paramount. So yes, we did.
That's good to know.
And
Thank you.
I don't read the paper, so I can't comment. I won't comment on anything.
Oh, there's close to $100 million that's been discussed for ARP, and I have to read the paper because it's part of what I do. But anyways, thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's all I have for this round.
Thank you, Senator Duenas. Senator Torres, do you have any questions for the panels?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I'd like to ask Mr. Steve Guerrero, based on the estimates on page 4 of your presentation, on the provisions for tax refunds, it appears that the government of Guam will pay out $145 million in total tax refunds for fiscal year 2022, correct? But we will receive also an advance or reimbursement from the federal government in the amount of approximately $110 million. And that you have here listed as the earned income tax credit reimbursement, about $55.8 million, the child tax credit receipts, advance and regular, of about 31.6 million, and then the additional child tax credit reimbursements that typically is 20 million, and this year you estimate 23,480. Now, can you confirm my understanding that because of these advances or reimbursements from the federal government for the EITC and the CTC and the ACTC, the net impact then of paying the tax refunds to the fiscal year 2022 budget is, in essence, a net of 35 million in tax refunds? Would you say that that's an accurate understanding if we were to start with the gross provisions for tax refunds of 145 million and back out the federal reimbursements of about 110 million? That leaves us with a net of 35. Is that a correct understanding?
Yes, Senator, you are correct. It would be net 35 million.
Right. So we start out with 145, but the reimbursement is in fact 110 this year, where the unfunded mandates, as Mrs. Shimizu has mentioned, is now going to be realized this fiscal year 2022. So with that clarification, I'd like to then ask Mr. Byrne from DOA. Mr. Byrne, what would be the impact then of a 75 million refund provision, or even a 35, or even a 125 refund provision to the annual budget, as opposed to a 35 million refund provision?
Thank you, Senator. And I think you're asking on a budgetary basis, not
Yes.
an accounting basis,
Correct.
which is going to be, it's going to look very different. What you're suggesting and what Mr. Guerrero confirmed to be so is true, but then in this calculation that's sitting, and maybe that's the root of the problem, the calculations are sitting in this income paragraph in the budget also takes out another 40 million and uses some of that credit for purposes not to do with the refund, and that's what bumps up the refund again to the 75 million. The refund difference to 75 million.
And I think when we were having this debate on Friday, that was the point of confusion, I think, for many, is just the way that it was categorized by OFB. And for their purposes, it was just a matter of laying it all out there. But I agree that the way that it was laid out there caused the body to be a little confused. But what I just wanted to establish is that now we really are dealing with a budget number that is significantly greater. We could proffer that with this $110 million refund, there is the ability now for the government and for this legislature to consider those, perhaps, and it could be those projects that are mandated by law that we know now are in the works for considerations, such as the Healthcare Center of Excellence and the new Departments of Corrections facility, and perhaps even the representations that were made in the executive order to the nurses. So I understand where everybody is concerned about where we are in a position now where we have to be cognizant of those projects that are out there that we must fund and contemplate how to fund. But I think at the beginning, I just want to clarify that we needed to clear up really when it comes to what the tax obligation is, what the true set-aside number needs to be, and how we are really much better postured this fiscal year to realize those tax refunds, not only the general tax refunds, but the earned income tax credit reimbursements, the earned income tax credit refunds, the child tax credit refunds, and the additional child tax credit refunds.
Right, and if I may, Senator, I think we also have to consider that some of these child tax credit refunds may possibly be made in the current financial year. And I'll ask Director Shimizu to talk a little bit about that. But to the extent that these credits are spent in the current financial year, they're not available again for the next financial year. So
yes, I'd like more clarification.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, so with regards to the child tax credit, and in particular, what the ARP Act did was allow for 50% of that to be paid before the end of December 2021. And so, for example, for an individual who has a qualifying child that's under age 6, that's 5 and under, they have the potential to receive for that one child up to $1,800 in 2021. In the continental United States, the IRS has begun the rollout of the child tax credit, the advance portion, and for that particular taxpayer, that individual would receive $300 a month beginning July and going to December. So that 300 times 6 is going to be the $1,800, right? And that's what we've been seeing a lot of is this $300 a month payment. We are currently in discussions with the IRS, and we have been kind of waiting on just the final approval for our implementation plan. It's possible that for Guam taxpayers that will, I mean, at this point, we're already in the month of August, but I mean, it's possible that we may begin to pay out to our Guam taxpayers. I'm hoping no later than September that we may begin to be paying out taxpayers for the advance. Of course, we're in August. We're hopeful that we'll be able to get the plan approved soon, but best case scenario is we'll have potentially August and September, but potentially September for sure, because we're at the, well, more certain because we're already kind of at past midpoint of August. And so that's what Director Byrne is referring to, the fact that some portion of that advance, maybe some portion of the monies might already be paid out in 2021 fiscal year, and that portion is going to be whatever's paid before September 30, with the remaining to have to be paid by the end of December.
Thank you. And theoretically, then it wouldn't be applied to 2022. It would be 2021. That portion that's reimbursed before the fiscal year budget.
On a budgetary basis, yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I believe I'm out of time.
Thank you, Senator Torres. Senator Nelson, do you have any questions, ma'am?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Sorry, let me just, is this better? Okay, just to caveat into the child tax credit discussion, Daphne, so if for FY 2021 you'll be receiving an advancement of 50% in reimbursement, is that the only amount that the government will be reimbursed for CTC, is 50% for FY21?
Apologies for that, Senator. Thank you. Regarding the CTC itself, the full child tax credit is going to be now funded by the federal government. And so it will be 100% of the child tax credit now will be funded going forward, and that's permanent.
Okay, and this is starting from FY 2021, is that correct?
The advanced portion, yes,
Okay.
but it is for a tax year. So for a Form 1040, that's for 2021.
Yes, okay. And then as we appropriate, now we are listing the taxes here, just so that there's more transparency. The child tax credit is now going to be reimbursed wholly in FY22 for 31.5 million, around there?
So for purposes of kind of conservatism, and I believe that when perhaps OFB can chime in, but I believe that what was done here was that this perhaps is maybe the average of the amounts that have been paid out in the CTC that have not been reimbursed over the last 3 or so years. So this amount, this 31.59, I believe, is based on how much historically we've paid out that we have not been reimbursed for.
Okay, and this is going to be the estimated amount moving forward.
Right, and so again, we know that the child tax credit itself for tax year 2021 has been increased from a maximum of $2,000 to a one-time, so it's not a permanent increase. The funding to Guam is permanent, meaning that the amount that's going to be paid or funded by the federal government for this particular credit is permanent as per the ARP Act. However, the increase in the child tax credit from $2,000 to $3,000 or $3,600 is a one-time increase, although it is contemplated, and I know there's a lot of discussion about it in Washington, D.C. about perhaps permanizing it, but until that becomes law, it's a one-time increase.
Okay.
Sorry, so to go back to your question, the 31 is based on how we've calculated it before. The ACTC, though, as we've talked about before, likely because of the characterization of the child tax credit now being a refundable credit, we'll see that amount be reduced because people will get it at the front end instead of getting it as the additional child tax credit. Again, because historically, you could only get the child tax credit to the extent of your tax liability. So for example, if you had a tax liability of $700, you could get the child tax credit, $700, but then you would have to receive the remaining part as the additional.
Okay, thank you. But the child tax credit, the advance and regular of 31.5 mil, and then your ACTC, which is your additional child tax credit reimbursement of 23.4 mil. Those are the correct numbers. Is that true?
Based on what we've, it's our best estimate based on historical. Once we do have our plan approved, though, Senator Nelson, we'll be able to provide you with more certainty in terms of the actual figure.
Okay, and then, which brings me to page 9, right? And we were discussing this before we started our session. And so in page 9, section B, or excuse me, section 7B, it says no more than 10% of all CTC, advance and regular, and ACTC received by the government of Guam shall be deposited in the general fund. And so my question is since this is a first-time reimbursement for the CTC, right, have you been operating at that level of 10% anyway? Has DRT been operating at the level of the 10% for specifically CTC money that has been paid out for the tax refunds?
Yes, Senator Nelson, historically we have, and then of course in 2021 fiscal year, we've gone back as well to the governor's office, and with the help of BBMR, and of course, we've been able to request for additional overtime for things that we've never had overtime for before. So for example, I know at the Special Economic Service, the issue of the federal contractor program, that was brought up, and we are actually at this point, we have 2 performance audits that are being done or performed by the Office of the Public Auditor. And I know there's a lot of concern about our collections and our ability to do or perform industry audits, we call them. So actually, in fiscal year 2021, of course, with the support of the governor and with the help of BBMR, we've been able to actually get more overtime so that way we can actually perform these industry audits so that we can work on our collections. And again, that's something that, yes, so to answer your question, yes, we've been operating, utilizing perhaps the full amount of the 10% that we have been allocated historically, but it is possible for that 10% to be increased, just again, based on the fact that we do have increased efforts to do enforcement and collections, and of course, in terms of the language, this language, it was requested that the language be expanded somewhat so that way there's a little bit more flexibility in terms of overtime, because really historically, again, it's really been for income tax processing and I believe motor vehicle driver's license processing. So some of the additional enforcement efforts that we wish to undertake, we wanted to make sure that was addressed in the upcoming budget.
So are you telling me that this 10%, which ranges on this FY22 budget about $5 million, a little over 5 mil, is specifically used for operation overtime?
So historically, so we don't, with regards to the contemplation of the
Because I
use-
haven't heard any new
but-
hiring or any, I haven't heard you speak of
Sorry.
any new hiring or any plan to hire. You're just working off of overtime, so the employees are being overworked at this moment.
Actually, so a portion of the 10% is actually used to fund positions. So we do have positions that are funded by the 1.8 or the 2 million that we historically on an annual basis have been receiving from this. We have headcount that is funded from this particular fund source.
So 1.8 and 2 million, or
No, sorry.
1.8 roughly 2 million?
It's about $2 million is what,
Okay. 2 million, okay. So then the CTC will give you an additional 3.1 million. Will you be able to hire people that of the amount equating to the needs of DRT and also to the salaries of 3.1 million within the next fiscal year? Will you be able to hire that many people?
You know, I don't know if we'll be able to hire enough people to because of the way that the hiring process kind of works, but I can say that our increased efforts in collections, I mean, I'll tell you, it was really a stretch, and I really had to reach out to, you know, BBMR for their assistance because, again, historically, our efforts and the overtime that we've been authorized has really been focused on income tax processing. Our teams work really hard to do income tax processing, and probably we're hovering a little bit over 100 days, but, you know, as I mentioned to Governor, I believe that at least in the last 18 years or so, that on an across-the-board kind of equal basis or fair basis, you know, likely that's something that we probably haven't seen before. So that's where we are, but it has taken a lot of our team members, you know, of course, they work 6 days a week, and that is like Monday through Thursday, they work an additional extra 2 hours, and then on Saturday, they work another 8 hours. So that's 16 extra hours a week. And so, of course, the idea is that we wouldn't have to be running that kind of overtime in order to be able to sustain that. But of course, we don't have enough headcount, I think, to take, I think the ideal is to hire additional headcount so that we will not have to continue to have people run that kind of overtime, again, because, you know, we're only human beings, and the reality is it is a lot to be working 6 days a week. And, you know, although people do get paid overtime, you know, sometimes really the issue of you know, family time and the quality time that they get with, you know, to be outside of the office it becomes problematic. And so, you know, I think we always have to try to push for some type of work-life balance. And of course, what we hope to get to is where we don't have to do 6 days a week of overtime in order to be able to accomplish the things that we are aiming to achieve.
Okay, thank you. So in the beginning of about 2 years ago, we were discussing about Department of Revenue and Taxation and technological improvements to make the workload easier for Department of Revenue and Taxation personnel that work there. How far what kind of strides have you made since then to provide the employees the technology that they need in order to be able to process things in a less manual fashion?
Okay, so, and thank you, Senator, for that. So since FY 2019 and coming to present, some things that we have done in the FY 2020 budget, and thank you to the legislature at that time for allowing for us to have $168,000 so that we could purchase 80 computers. So we actually purchased 80 computer workstations, and we did have, prior to that, at that point, we actually had some people who still had Windows Vista, which I believe means that their computers were as old as, I think, 2000, they were from 2007, around that time. So for people to have a computer that's probably 13 years old, older than some children of ours or grandchildren, you know, it kind of was not acceptable. So that was one thing that we did in FY 2020. In FY 2021, of course, Governor did allow for us to have some monies from the CARES Act, or to allocate monies from the CARES Act funds that were provided to our government. We utilized the CARES Act monies for multiple things. One, we bought another 80 computers, so that allowed for us to have 160 new computer workstations. We purchased also 6 or 7 laptops, and again, that was to assist in this effort to do teleworking. We also purchased 20 tablets, and again, that's to assist with teleworking, but also because we wanted to move toward perhaps some utilizing some kiosks for some of our initiatives, for example, perhaps to provide the use of those tablets as people come in to do registration or as they come in to file their BPT, because really the reality is you don't need a full computer workstation as we did before in order to do some of the things that people are able to do online. Another thing that we did was we expanded the Form 1040 so that way more filers could be added on to the or have the ability to file online. As of the other day, we had over 6,200 people file online their Forms 1040. That's the most that we've ever had probably since 2005 when we first began to accept Forms 1040 online. And on an average year, we were receiving maybe 1,300 Forms 1040. So we went from 1,300 Forms 1040 being filed online to over 6,200. And if we say that perhaps our taxpayer base is, 70,000, maybe that's like 7% or so. But it's definitely higher. I mean, it's gone up, exponentially from where we were before. In addition to that, in 2019...
How about software programs?
I'm sorry.
Have you updated any programs or your software that you use? Are you focusing on a reorganization for DRT? I understand that there are some areas that need to be restructured within your organization, within your agency. Are you focusing on that? Or do you have a plan for that? The reason why I'm asking, right, is because, okay, so you're doing all of these things, but the people still had to perform overtime. And so I'm asking you if there was any technological advancement made towards the DRT programs that could that were able to perhaps limit the overtime done, or are you looking to hire more personnel?
Well,
And so you have this additional $3.1 million coming in and 10%, so I'm asking, is there a plan already that you're focusing on to hire more personnel or to restructure the agency, and what would be that cost?
Sure, and so with regards to, I'm sorry to go back to it, with regards to technological advancements, the expansion of the 1040, actually we believe that the expansion of the 1040 could potentially allow for about half of our tax filers, which is about 80,000 tax filers, income tax filers to be able to file online. That was huge. We also actually, because of, if you recall, the BPT is now required to be filed online, we actually had to also make some enhancements to our system so that we could be able to accommodate for that. All of that should actually equate to additional savings. However, it does take time. And so, where we still have a ways to go to get to having 50 or 60 or 70% of our filers file online for income taxes. And then, of course, even given the fact that we do and have made strides in our BPT area, there's still a backlog that has to be addressed, and that's something, of course, that we've run into. In addition to that, though, we do have, the driver's license system. We were able to also enhance that, and I'll tell you now, actually today, we began our testing and training phase for the launch of our driver's license system, which will allow for people to renew licenses and replace their licenses, including certain real ID compliant IDs to be done online. So in as many areas as possible, we're really moving toward automation. And I think, just to share with you though, I think a lot of the concern is that if we do have automation, that people may lose their jobs. And I know that's something that as well or that maybe there's not as need for as many people. I think that the pathway to getting to the point where we're not going to need any overtime at all, or where we're going to not need as many people, that point is not close to, it's quite far from where we are. If we're having to have the majority of our people operate on an overtime basis, if we're having to have, them also, just not even for the personal income tax, but other things, it may be difficult.
I get it, Daphne.
Yeah.
I get it. But that's not my question, right?
Okay, sorry about that,
And I'd like
Senator.
first of all, I'd like to thank you guys, the whole DRT for the enormous and tremendous amount of work that they had to do. And I know there was a lot of concerns about equitability as far as them being paid in the same levels when they were coming to work during the pandemic. And I know that was a struggle to work through. And so, and I thank you for all of the advancements made, for us having the ability to do our BPT online, for giving us the ability to register our vehicles online, file our taxes online. It seems more efficient that way. And now I'm not talking about the natural attrition if technology should come into play. That's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about we're seeing that there's a 10% additional 3.1 million that is coming from the reimbursement, right, in the statute. And so I'm just asking, with this 3.1 million, right, and you're saying that the real issue is the employees having to work overtime, and you guys are really stretched thin, right? And I understand that. I mean, probably many of them have not taken a vacation or taken some time away for over a year, right, just to service the community, and I thank you for that. My question is that when we're trying to do away with overtime and we look at the option to hire more personnel, will you be able to hire personnel within 6 to 8 months of the additional $3.1 million that is available for you? Or, is there a plan in place for that?
So,
Senator Nelson, stand by, Ms. Simmons. I just want to let you know you reached your 5 minutes, but you were yielded 2 minutes and 26 seconds Friday from Senator Clinton.
That's correct.
So please continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And so, Daphne, can you just answer really
sure.
quickly?
So just to kind of clarify, so the reality of it is in addition to, of course, what we already have, we do have some things forthcoming. For example, the rules and regs for cannabis, which will allow for the licensing of cannabis businesses, right? Those are things we currently don't have enough enforcement people for. We also have other, mandates that are coming down. For example, there's the Unarmed Combat Commission. I know that you're probably aware that some people have been appointed as well for those boards. And the Department of Revenue and Taxation actually, of course, provides support for, and in some areas, the lead for some of these commissions and boards. And so again, if you want to say 3.1 million and we try to divide it by $50,000, just say annual salary inclusive, annual compensation inclusive of benefits is 50,000. That's 62 people. Can we hire 62 people? I mean, is it aggressive? Perhaps. But, the reality is that, and I don't know what our ultimate budget's going to be, but I would work to advocate for as much funding as our agency can get because, as you could see over the last 2.5 years, we've really, I think, made great strides. In 2.5 years, we've begun to do things that even I think, it's during a public health emergency or even outside of a public health emergency are important. You have a portal to check the status of your refunds. You can do a direct deposit of a refund. These are things that, were just ideas when I just started in 2019 and through a public health emergency we're able to do. And so, I believe that given the additional funding, and of course, thank you for the support from the legislature, because of course, you've always been very supportive of the funding of our agency, that we'll be able to continue that and then, and then some, because,
Will you be able to hire 62 people in 1 year?
I don't know if we'll be able to hire 62 people. I do know that
What is your best guess projection to hire?
I'm sorry.
What is your best approximate number to hire?
I'm sorry, it's difficult to say.
Okay. And then for the rules and regs for cannabis, we all know that there's going to be a tax that supports this cannabis industry, so that should take care of itself. And then for the commissions and boards, okay, there's the fees and stuff like that. But I understand. I just wanted to know if you'd be able to hire all those people 1 year. If you can't, if you don't know the answer, then that's okay too, because I don't know the answer either. So if it's kind of how quickly DOA works, we'll get you those personnel. That's basically what it is, right? And how quickly you can train them into the workforce.
Right.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Director Shimizu, and thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Nelson. You still had time, but that's okay. Madam Speaker, do you have any questions for the panel?
Yes, thank you very much, and thank you to the panel. So I just want to follow up on the amount of set aside. So I have two main questions. It's regarding the amount that we are setting aside in this budget for tax refunds, and that whether that will allow us to promptly pay refunds. And the second train of questions is about the BPT estimates that seem to be different between BBMR and OFB. So BBMR said earlier that we might need to add 12 million to the CTC. Well, right now we're setting aside, well, in past years we've set aside 125 million for provision of tax refunds. This budget proposes to set aside 74 million for provision of tax refunds. And OFB earlier said we might need to add 12 million to the CTC estimates, which would bump the 74 to 87, or he's suggesting that. And the other thing I wanted to check is, but why not 125, which is the same as this year, if we are not sure yet how this EITC is going to be, given to us, whether it's going to be given to us in advance, in a trust fund or not, and that type of thing. I mean, are we? It looks to me like there's still a possibility that you might need to pay it out before you get the refund, or the reimbursement, sorry.
Senator, if I'll defer to Director Shimizu as to the mechanics of it, but as far as the cash flows are concerned, it's my understanding that we will get this money to pay out the 50% child credit in advance, because that's what's happening on the mainland, and we're required and expected and are facilitated to follow that same process. So I think it's safe to assume that money is going to come in that form, and I'm comfortable with what Director Shimizu said.
Oh no, if I can, my question is, so BBMR estimated to add 12 million to the CTC, bump up our provision from 74 to 87 million. That's one question on CTC. But what I'm asking, why not 125 if we're not sure how the EITC is going to come in? That might, if we're not sure whether that's going to come in advance, like the CTC that you described, or not, and whether we're going to need, we might need to pay that and then wait for reimbursement.
I think there's two separate things, Senator.
Yes.
The 12 million is an estimate.
Separate, yes.
Is an estimate of the child tax credit that we think we're going to pay out in the current fiscal year, and therefore doesn't impact the income for the subsequent fiscal year, which is the subject of this budget bill.
So let me just stop there then. Lester, are you not asking anymore that the tax provision be changed to 87 million?
Yes, Senator, thank you. On page 4, the line that says general fund provision for tax refund payments, the 74 million, that's the number that we're asking to be adjusted upwards to, again, make sure we have sufficient reimbursements. So the 74, we'd like that to be 87. And then when you take the federal trust fund monies that we're going to be getting, I think cumulatively we'll be able to we'll have sufficient revenues to pay our tax liabilities.
All right, so that's what I was talking about, 87 million. And I'm asking why not 125 if we're going to account for the EITC that we don't know yet how it will come in. As you had said in last week, that the EITC, we're not sure yet whether it's coming in a trust fund in advance or whether we are going to need to be paying that out. In other words, we need to set aside the funds to pay it out before we are reimbursed. If we're not sure yet, I thought that's what you were trying to tell us. And I don't know, Daphne, do you follow that?
Right, and so I know, so currently and thank you, Speaker, for your question, because I know there's some level of, this is quite complicated, right? It's all credits, it's all going to be reimbursed, it's just the mechanism for reimbursement that's kind of at question. And so for what we're being reimbursed for right now, the additional child tax credit, To BBMR's point, we pay those out, and then on a quarterly basis, we request for reimbursement, and then we receive those as a reimbursement. For the child tax credit, though, and again, it's the first time that we're going to be receiving reimbursement, and it's going to be a permanent reimbursement. For that portion of it, we're actually, at this point, it looks very likely that we'll get that monies upfront as an advance, similar to how we got EIP, and then put the money in a trust fund so we could pay it out. So that's very likely. And then with regards to the earned income tax credit, you're right. It's that at this point, because we haven't even finished the CTC plan discussion, we haven't got to the EITC discussion. So it could go either way. It could either be done as a reimbursement or it could be done as an advance. Of course, we're always advocating for an advance, and the reason is so that we can maintain and not have to touch our general fund monies. That's something that's very important. But ultimately, it becomes not our decision. So it will depend on how the Treasury and the federal government decide that is going to be paid to us.
Do you think we should set aside the money until we know that?
I do think that it is reasonable that at least, beginning, so even if we get it as a reimbursement, if we're able to continue processing and process our returns consistent with how we are right now, I believe that it is possible that we'll begin to receive a portion at least by April 2022, which is following the first quarter of, when people start filing their income tax returns. So I do believe that starting at that point, in terms of a timing basis, that on the EITC portion, that we may begin to be able to rely on the monies coming. And that's because it's for tax year 2021 returns.
So you're saying you're saying we should rely on that money coming in by April?
If the money's not received in as an advance.
I know, but
yes.
That's what I'm asking.
Yes.
Do we have any idea?
No, I do not know.
So, Mr. Byrne, if we set aside $125 million like we did last year, and we accommodate, payment for EITC so that we are allowed to pay those out before the reimbursement comes in, not knowing when that reimbursement's coming in right now, just like we're doing or what's being proposed to do with the CTC and the ACTC, wouldn't that allow us to pay those refunds faster? I mean, right now we still have 23 million processed awaiting payment, and I know that you've made great strides to pay these out sooner than prior administrations, so I commend you for that. I'm just saying we could get even faster. We still have April that are pending, and we could be even faster if we set these EITC, and especially for those people who need EITC credit. Those are the ones with the lowest incomes, and child tax credits, of course. So I want to know if we don't, So those are my concerns, is that if we don't know right now the process that the EITC is coming in, if we should be spending it in advance or allocating it for budget purposes if we're not sure yet.
Senator, obviously what we pay out depends on cash flow. We are very conscious, we've always noted that our first charge is debt payment, our second charge is tax refunds. We've managed to manage the cash flow situation this year between us, and that's why the press releases that come out each week come out under both our departments. We've managed to make sure that we pay out what is available to be paid out consistently. And for the very first time, we're here in August with paying out tax refunds for error-free returns that are almost at the end of April. We've only got a few more days in April to pay out. I think that's something that we've never done that before. It's a great achievement. I don't see the situation being particularly different next year, because whatever we do in the words in the budget, everything depends on cash flow. So you could take the view that you go back to what you had before and put in 125 million, or you can follow the logic that Mr. Carlson's just put forward and put in 84 or whatever the amount it turns out to be after we've paid out these child tax refunds. But ultimately, it's cash flow that determines it, and that's what we've managed to manage well.
Right, so the greater amount that we set aside, the quicker we can pay the refunds. And again, we've still got 23 million outstanding and processed already, but we're waiting for cash. That's why I'm asking about, putting that EITC in advance, or setting it aside, as we have always, in case our reimbursement doesn't come in till later, so that they can be paid, not waiting for that cash reimbursement. The other question was about the BPT. So BBMR suggesting that if we use July 2021 BPTs collected, which is 27 million for the month, and multiply that by 12 months, that would be about 324 million versus OFB's projection in our current substitute budget of 238 million. But BBMR suggesting that we don't adopt the 324 million, that we only adopt the 285 million, which is about 23 million a month, not 27 a month. So I just want to find out why not the higher amount? Why are you not projecting? The current tracking is 289 million, which is higher than what you are suggesting, 285. That's FY21.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. The 285 is what we're tracking. The budget that was passed was 304. I did concede.
Your tracking is 289?
No, it's 285, ma'am. This one here. On page 3 of the snapshot,
Okay.
it says FY21 revenue tracking, 285. The
Okay.
fifth line down.
You're right.
Yeah. Yeah, we're not in the $330 million range. I wish we were, but we're not. So yeah, we're tracking 285. We've collected on page 3, 229 million to date for the month of July. We're averaging about 25 million a month. So, that number can easily go up to around the 280 million mark. And therein lies the primary difference between OFB and BBMR. I think there's room to move upward from their 238, given what it is that we're seeing now. Most especially, as I mentioned earlier, the agreement that we have with the other general fund tax categories, individual, corporate, and withholding. So I leave that to the body to ponder.
All right, I guess, could I just ask Mr. Hiles and all of you, if right now we're tracking 285, well, for FY21,
Yeah.
with half of the year business occupancies were only, well, at least half of the year they were at 50%. It only lifted to 75% in April 2021 and then lifted to 100% in July 21. From October to April, so businesses were operating 50%. And we're still tracking 285. So, yeah, I guess just wanted. Are your estimates based on businesses being open going forward, or is that what we should expect? And shouldn't we, if that's the case, then shouldn't we expect the higher amount?
To some degree, I do agree with Mr. Guerrero on being a little conservative, so I'm not asking for the 295 that's in the executive budget request. So, I am looking at dropping it by like $15 million, just because I think it's trending in that area, and I think it's achievable.
I know my time is up, but if the
Yeah.
OFB and Mr. Hiles could also chime in on that.
Yes, okay, we'll just wrap it up we'll start with OB and then Mr. Hayes, right, will chime in on it, and then we'll end the questions. Mr. Guerrero.
Yeah. Yes, Senator. You know, we do have a disparity in the BBT, and like I mentioned earlier, Mr. Carlson is correct. We are, you know, they are tracking about 285 million by the end of the year, and that's based on current revenue tracking. He's using the higher number, which is July, which I believe is 27 million. If you took the average, I think, over the last 9, 10 months, you'd probably be a little bit lower, maybe about 23, 24 million. So taking those numbers into account and projecting out, you're going to get a lower number than what actually was being projected. But then again, you know, I did mention that times are good now, considering. Starting October next year, things are going to change, and we know that. And the thing about it is that I'm just a little bit more leery about the unknowns. One is that we do know that PUA is going to end. We do know there's a residual effect with PUA. People will not be out there spending. We know people are still unemployed. We know tourism is not going to get anywhere close to what we ended in fiscal year 20 and even 21. So taking all those things into consideration and you know, just from what Mr. Heil said earlier, from what we got from basically accounting experts out there in the field, telling us what they feel, you know, what they project Guam would be like in the next couple of years. We just feel that the amount that's being tracked now is going to drop. How much, you know, that's the big question, I guess. How much are we willing to negotiate? And I just feel, like I said, that, you know, being a little bit conservative is just the approach I've always taken. Am I too conservative? I don't know. But what I know today is a number I feel that I can be comfortable with. And you know, that's all I can say on that one.
Thank you. Mr. Hiles, I'm trying to get to details of why we should go up or down on the BPT. BBMR had projected that we are bringing in this much money despite businesses being closed, you know, half the year, and that we should expect that to continue. Yet OFB is projecting that we should not be optimistic about that, and I guess I'd like to ask you.
I think that the tourism was essentially closed last year. We're expecting a little bit better this year. So using the tracking from last year with basically minimal tourism is an appropriate starting point for this year's revenues. There's much uncertainty with the federal expenditures that could improve. We know that we're going to lose the PUA, but a little bit of a follow-up on Senator Blas's question from Friday. We're going to lose the PUA expenditures in the economy, and it's correct that we don't know what the federal government will do with regard, for sure, with the infrastructure spending, the hard infrastructure and the social infrastructure, but I expect something will happen. Also, we have significant amounts of federal money already here that's approved with the, in addition to the coronavirus state fund, according to the federal expenditures report, $578 million, the educational stabilization fund, $459 million, medical assistance program, $124 million. So there's significant amounts of money already confirmed that we have available for expenditure. So that's a reason for optimism. Another point is I want to clarify is while federal expenditures are up, not all the federal expenditures are the same. For example, we're very fortunate this year in terms of government of Guam's budget is somewhat different from the general economy, because when the federal government has relieved the local government of an expenditure for the EITC or the some medical payments and also the child care credit, if there's $100 million that formerly GovGuam expenses that the federal government picks up, that saves the government of Guam $100 million. If the federal government spends $100 million on a federal construction project, like with DOD, on average, GovGuam would get 10% of that back in revenue. So the relief of, let's say, $100 million would be, for government of Guam expenses, would be translated to almost $1 billion in federal construction projects in terms of government of Guam revenues. So this hearing is focused primarily on the revenue and expenses of the government of Guam, which I think are, because of the federal expenditures, are in a better shape than the economy in general.
Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. My colleagues, we will recess, and due to the storm, we will come back, reconvene at 9 o'clock on Wednesday. Now, if it's announced today that there won't be a storm tomorrow, we will come back then tomorrow
Mr. Chair.
at 9 a.m., okay? So we just got to play it by ear based on the governor's announcement, okay?
Mr. Chair,
Yes, madam.
thank you, Mr. Chair. Was it requested earlier about the CRER report for the special funds? If we can get that mailed to us, I mean, no, we might not be in tomorrow, but if we can get that emailed to the senators, that would be very helpful. Thank you.
We're working on it now.
Okay, thank you
Okay,
so
they
much.
work on it. So, my colleagues, please make
Mr.
sure you
Chair.
listen to the news.
Mr. Chair,
Let's
if we
see
could
what's
just
going on.
clarify,
Yes, Madam Speaker.
if we're not in court too at 9 a.m. tomorrow, we are reconvening at 9 a.m. tomorrow?
That's the
If we're
intent.
not in court
Yes.
too? And
Yes,
if
ma'am.
we are in court too, then we are reconvening on Wednesday
On
at 9
Wednesday.
a.m.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
All right? The Committee of the Whole is now in recess.